have 4 majors, and this project is really just an accumulation of all of those. It's bringing in the gender focus from women's studies and the linguistics focus from both English and Spanish, but also the culture from Spanish as well, and as well as anthropology. So this really is just the accumulation of my entire academic career so far. So before we can start this conversation, we have to ask, what is gender? It seems like a little complicated now in our society, but I'm going to break it down into 3 different types of gender. So the first type we have is physical gender, which can also be known as sex. So this is going to be referring to the physical body and genitalia. So it's referring to what we can see. So because of this, it's usually considered as a binary, like a male-female. But that's it. It's just the physical representation. And for our purposes, we are going to generalize it as the binary of male-female. So then there's social gender. So social gender is the way that a society implements culture onto that body. It's how they map different cultural ideas, such as like outfits and work roles. And who's taking care of the children, all of that. It's how they map that onto that binary body that we were talking about before. So social gender is going to be different for every single culture because we have different cultural elements that are going onto the body, and we also look at the bodies in different ways. So because of that, there's going to be certain things that some cultures consider to be social gender that other cultures don't. A really good example is going to be homosexuality. Some cultures are going to look at homosexuality as like a separate gender, which requires completely different social roles, dress, all of that kind of stuff. Sometimes it's going to be a homosexual male will become almost, in a sense, similar to a transgender person, where they completely take on feminine roles. In other cases, they're going to fill this completely new space of this 3rd or maybe 4th gender. Whereas other cultures are going to look at homosexuality as something somewhat separate from gender. So related, but separate. Sexuality would be completely different. So the final type of gender we're going to talk about is linguistic gender. So this is basically how the physical gender and social gender appear in language. It's that simple. So there's 3 different types of linguistic gender that I have identified for the purpose of this paper. The first type is going to be semantic gender. So every single language, as far as we know, has semantic gender. And what that means is that there are words in the language that carry the meaning of gender. So English, for example, has the word woman, which infers femininity, and man, which infers masculinity. So another example, or an example of a semantic language would be the language Mal, which has, it breaks up, it has 3 types of noun classifications. It has a masculine noun class, a feminine noun class, and an inanimate noun class, which are usually marked by the ending sounds in that word. However, they don't change anything else in the sentence, and we're going to talk about that a little bit because that's what makes a semantic gender different from the other 2 categories we're going to talk about. So the next are going to be languages with gendered pronouns. So these are languages that have that semantic gender, but then on top of that, they have some kind of gender distinction within the pronouns. So Mali, like I talked about, doesn't have that. They don't have gender distinction in the pronouns. They have the same pronoun regardless of gender, and it just changes for, say, person or case. So an example of a language with gendered pronoun would be English. So we have the pronouns he, she, it, and more recently we have they, if you're accepting that as a singular form, that those infer some type of gender. So English would be a type of language with gendered pronouns. So then the final kind is a language with grammatical gender. So this is a language which takes these noun classes, so a classification of nouns, into separate sections, and then each of those classes somehow affects the rest of the sentence. So talking about noun classes, again, that's a classification system of nouns. And there's going to be 2 types of noun classes that we're going to look at. There's semantic classes and semantic informal classes. So semantic classes are going to be, it's based off of the meaning. That's what decides which way a word goes. So if it's a word that's usually associated with with femininity in that culture, it becomes it goes into the feminine class. But there's also semantic and formal, and in that case, it's all nouns are somehow mapped into the system, regardless of how they relate to that social gender. So then what differentiates the grammatical gender, as I said, is it changes parts of the rest of the sentence. So it has agreement. And the two main parts of agreement that we're looking at are going to be adjectives and verbs. So the gender or noun class of the noun some way affects the adjective or the verb. So a good example of this is going to be Spanish. So in Spanish, the word for pen is la pluma, which is feminine, which we can tell from the article la, and it ends with an A sound. So in order to say the red pen, we would use the word rojo, meaning red, but we would have to change this to the feminine, making it roja. So it would be la pluma roja in order to say the red pen, because it's a feminine noun. And it is important to point out that there are some noun classes that are not gendered at all. And there's going to be some that even come up, that have come up in my research. But for my purpose, I'm only considering a language to have grammatical gender if the noun class somehow distinguishes humans. So as I said before with the Mali language, that has the masculine, feminine, and inanimate, so it distinguishes humans between masculine and feminine. Whereas another language, the Blackfoot language of the Native American language of North America, they have a noun class that differentiates between animates and inanimates, which means that all humans fit into one category. So in that case, we wouldn't consider it a grammatical gender, even though it does have a noun classification system. So here are a few questions that really drove my thinking. I'm not going to read through them all, but some major ones are: how common is grammatical gender? Does grammatical gender limit the cultural understanding of gender? And can cultures understand non-binary gender when they have a language with binary grammatical gender? So my methods. So as I said, this is an accumulation of all of my majors, so it is a cross-disciplinary analysis. So I created my own data pool using research from both the linguistic field and anthropological field. So I looked at ethnographies, so looked at the societies of these cultures and mapped them to linguistic data I was able to find about the languages that they speak, and pairing those up for my own data pool. So some limitations with this research is, first of all, I have to use pre-existing research. I'm doing a global analysis, which means I can't go everywhere. I can't go to every single one of these cultures and do my own research. I physically cannot do that, and financially I can't, unfortunately. So I have to use things that people have already put out, already published, that are accessible to me. So that's going to cause some limitations on, because potentially the linguistic and ethnographic research are going to be at different, from different time periods, potentially even slightly different towns per se, even if they're the same cultures. But most importantly, they're written by different people in most cases, which means that I am getting a different filter because all of that information is being filtered through someone else before it is coming to me. And on top of that, I can only look at research that's already been done. So another limitation I had in creating the data pool is I really wanted to make sure that I had a good geographical distribution to make sure I had a really good sample size. So I didn't want to do like 20 bajillion languages from Australia and only one from South America. I wanted to make sure it was spread out. So I ended up collecting 202 cultures with their respective languages. And as you can see, I managed to spread it out pretty well. There's probably a few more points that could pop up on here from like similarly within the country, but like even just this, it's pretty well spread out. So what I did from there, after I've collected this data pool, is I analyzed each of the languages and put them into one of those 3 categories that I talked about. So now the results. So out of the 202 languages and cultures that I looked at, 46 of them had a language with grammatical gender, 17 had a language with gendered pronouns, and all the rest, 136 languages, only had semantic gender, so they did not have gender within their grammar. But as you can see, the average number of social genders for each of those societies is actually relatively close, around 2.5. So taking a closer look at the grammatical gender, as I said, the average is close to 2.5. This one's 2.3 with a standard deviation of 7.1, which is the largest standard deviation we have right now, or of all of them. And it is the median data pool set. It's not the smallest, but it's certainly not as large as the last one that we'll look at. So these noun classes. There are 3 different noun classes that we see within the grammatical gender. We see languages with 4 noun classes, languages with 3 noun classes, and languages with 2 noun classes. So I've mapped that out. With the 4 noun classes, there's 3 languages, and all of them are semantic. With the 3, there's 11 classes, 8 of which are semantic and formal, and 3 of which are semantic. And then the rest are all have a two noun class system, which in most cases is usually masculine, feminine, and 29 of those are semantic and formal, while the last 3 are semantic. So then mapping all the social genders onto this, we see that within the grammatical gender, there are 2 cultures that have that represent 5 genders within the society, and then we have 12 that see 3 genders, and all the rest, the other 32, understand 2 genders within their society. So from this, we can see that there's an overwhelming majority of grammatical gender in the binary for both noun class and for social gender. So now moving on to the pronouns. This average is 2.41, so fairly close to 2.5 as well. And this has a standard deviation of 0.6. It is the smallest data source, so it is going to be the least accurate, because it is the most uncommon type of language, which is cool, because, I mean, English is one of those. So as we can see, within these languages, these are the different pronouns that have some type of gender distinction. So there's 1 language that has first person distinction, 3 languages that have second person distinction, 1 language that has third person and a first and or second distinction, 4 languages that have distinction in all third person, singular and plural, and all the rest, the other 8, only distinguish in third person singular. So English would fall into that category, because we only distinguish between the singular he, she, it. So similar noun class breakup. As you can see here, all of the languages that have 0 noun classes have obviously no semantic or formal, because there's no classes to distinguish them. But as you can see, almost all of the noun classes for the gendered pronouns are semantic. There's only 1 which is semantic and formal. So moving on to the social genders, again, we can see here that an overwhelming, or maybe not an overwhelming majority, but most of them recognize 2 social genders. And then there's 5 that recognize 3, and there's 1 culture that recognizes 4 genders within the pronoun system. So in our final and largest data pool is the semantic gender. So there's 139 there with the average of 2.56 and a standard deviation of 0.64. So with the noun classes, we see that the majority of them fall into there's no class. So there's no noun class, so there's no distinction. And we see a sort of a more even spread between the semantic and formal and the just semantic. But what is interesting is that the semantic and formal are going to be the higher levels. So it's listed as a 5+ on noun classes. So that's going to include languages that have at least 5 noun classes. They can go all the way up to, say, 22. The Bantu languages of Africa are well known for having many, many noun classes. However, in most cases, the first noun class, class 1, is usually reserved for humans. So there is no distinction between the genders in most of those cases. So then, as we can see with the social genders, a good majority of them are also believe in the 2 gender system, but there is a good number of 3 genders, and most of that is going to be masculine, feminine, and then say a two-spirited or just a general third gender. There's 8 cultures that recognize 4 genders, and then there's 1 culture that recognizes 5 genders. So if we look at it overall, we see that of all of the languages that we looked at, the majority of them fall under of all of the cultures we looked at, the majority of them have an understanding of gender as a binary, the 2 form, with a good chunk of that being having a semantic gendered language. So a language that arguably is the easiest to have non-binary gender in, but we still see that the binary gender in this culture. And so on and so forth. What's really interesting is that we can see that there is grammatical gender up where a culture represents 5, where a culture sees 5 genders. And that's really interesting and really important to look back on those questions that I started with at the beginning, because this does show that languages with grammatical gender can in fact understand non-binary gender, especially in the 3 category. One of those languages in there is Italian. Italian has historically recognized a 3rd gender. And obviously if you dove more into the cultural analysis and drew your own conclusions, you could make arguments one way or the other whether that's a gender or not. But historically, the Italians say that it is a 3rd gender. And Italian would be a binary gendered grammar structure. So looking at the conclusions. So based on this data, what effect could linguistic gender have on social gender? As we see, obviously it's not an absolute. It's not an absolute, but we can see that in general, there's more grammatical gender down here in the binary gender. So it's not an absolute, but it could be a good predictor. So what does this tell us about how social gender is constructed in relationship to language? Well, first of all, it tells us that binary gender is not universal. Social gender is not universal at all, although it does seem rather common. And I would hypothesize that the reason for that is going to be history and European conquest. So the spread of European society, specifically Christianity, and their ideas of a binary culture are really what's causing that huge group at the bottom, regardless of the language categories. So then why is this type of analysis important in the conversation about gender? Again, gender is not universal. It's not universal and it's not binary. It changes with the culture, it changes with what we understand about ourselves, about our culture, about our science. It all changes. And gender can be influenced by so many things. I only looked at 2 things. I looked at just language and culture, but there's so many other elements that can go into that, including contact with other cultures and so on and so forth. So what this really tells us is that language doesn't have to be a barrier. Language does not have to be a barrier in the conversation of gender. It's something that, in my experience with Spanish speakers, it's something that I struggle with. How do I talk about non-binary gender in a binary gendered system? And this says there's no excuse. You can do it. You just have to be willing to. The society has to be willing to have those kinds of conversations, and they have to be willing to alter the language a little bit if they need to. And that is it.
All right, we have time for questions. So, but please wait until you have the mic. That way, the recording can catch the question.
I really liked your presentation. Thank you. I was wondering about the sort of more recent use of they as an alternative pronoun to avoid that kind of binary that you're talking about. And I was wondering if linguists play any kind of prescriptive role in the choice of, alternative pronouns, because I was thinking, for me, and I'm 58, and I have difficulty with new pronouns, right? Because I'm used to using my same old pronouns. I mean well, and I want to use new pronouns, but for me, they is clunky, and it trips me up and it can be confusing. You're not sure if you're talking about a single individual or multiple individuals. So for me, they seems inadequate in certain ways, right? And I was just wondering, are linguists getting involved, working with people in other disciplines to try to prescribe or make recommendations about pronouns as a way of getting them more universally used, or, you know?
So a big thing that I see with the linguistic academic field is that they understand that language is so personal. Like, language changes person to person, it changes group to group. So a lot of linguists in my understanding of them recognize that prescriptive grammar it's a cultural construct, ultimately. And I actually have done a lot of research on English pronouns. So what I've seen is, or I've looked into all the regular English pronouns, the he, she, it. I've also looked at what historically and prescriptively we're supposed to use for this ungendered person. And grammatically, it says that we're supposed to be using this he. But we can see in a lot of our canonical authors, Emily Dickinson is one specifically that I can think of offhand, that they've used the singular they for ages. We have a written record up to at least about 1300 of a singular they being used. Not necessarily in a non-gendered format, but in a singular format. And what we can also see is that there have been other pronouns that have been proposed to fill that semantics gap that we have, to fill that thing that's missing in English. And a lot of times those haven't worked. And ultimately the conclusion that I've come to through my research is that those language movements didn't have the social movements to back them. So the reason that the singular they right now is gaining so much traction is because there's such a strong social movement behind it. A really well-known pronoun that was recommended was thon. And that didn't happen because it didn't have the social movement, and it's too close to certain other things that some editors thought it was just an error. But it has this huge social movement, and to paraphrase Suzanne Romain, she basically says any cultural change is linguistic change, and vice versa. Like, you have to have one to have the other. You have to change the language to talk about it, but you also have to have a society that's willing to talk about it.
Thanks, yeah, Lindsey, that was great. The thing that blew my mind, and I got to make sure I understand this right, did you say there's 17 out of your 202 languages, only 17 have gendered pronouns?
So only 17 have gendered pronouns and no grammatical gender.
Oh, and no grammatical gender. Oh, okay.
So a good chunk, if not almost all of the ones that do have grammatical gender are also going to have pronoun distinction. But that 17 are ones like English that no longer have a grammatical gender, but still have that pronoun.
Oh, okay. Yeah, because that's important to realize. I mean, so many English speakers think everybody is a he or she, right? But there's plenty of languages that don't have a word for he or she, which you drew out. I guess then my other question would be thinking about languages like Italian and like Spanish that don't have a conceptual it, because they don't have a neuter, where again, like, we English speakers take for default, like, everything is a he or a she or an it, whereas like Romance languages don't actually have a non-gendered word, where we take this for granted. I wonder if you thought about that.
No, I certainly haven't. That's sort of what truly started me onto all of this. So with the example of Italian that I give, while they recognize a third gender that they call something along the lines of familio, sorry, I don't know Italian, I can't quite pronounce it, but familio still carries the grammatical gender, so it still has, say, a masculine connotation, so you have to consider what that means socially. So Italian, they're saying that they have this third gender, but it's still considered masculine in the culture. So if you're going in and looking at the psychoanalysis and all of that, you have to wonder how does that affect gender identity and gender understanding, and especially with these non-binary, these binary grammatical languages. Something that I sort of see is that when you are non-binary, you're seen as the other. You're seen as the thing that works or the other, which, I mean, happens outside of the binary grammar system too. But yeah, it's definitely interesting to look at with the psychoanalytics, and there have been certain movements to add, say, like a neuter to Spanish. There's been a couple things that have been included, like adding. So usually in Spanish, the O and the A represents masculinity and femininity, respectively, and some people have said put an E for gender neutral. And you'll see in Spanish writing, a lot of times they'll use like that @ symbol from our email. They'll use that to say one or the other. So there's pushes to change it, but that's such a, like, the gender's so intricate in their grammar system. It's a tough change to make.
Thank you.
I thought your talk was really interesting. Thanks for giving it. So I thought it was really interesting, if I understood you correctly, to learn that languages that are not linguistically gendered, I think your hypothesis was that once Christianity and sort of European power hit them, they sort of often were boxed into, just two genders, a binary understanding of social gender. So that suggests that sort of cultural power sort of trumped the sort of effect that language has on our makeup, because obviously language is really important, right? Really central to who we are. But in this case, I guess European power, backed by sort of military force, economic incentives, all this kind of stuff, had a big impact. So here's my question. Do you think it's more likely for languages that are non-gendered to sort of bounce back from that in this new age, in which, at least in some countries, we're talking much more about more open understandings of social gender? And do you think we have any examples in the world that you've encountered or read about of languages that linguistically are not gendered, well, I guess the language doesn't have to change, but do you see evidence, or is there any evidence of social attitudes opening up more toward more than just two genders, perhaps because people speak a language that wasn't gendered in the first place? Sorry, that was a really long question, but I just found the whole thing really interesting, so I just had to work it out in my own mind.
So I'm going to start by mentioning the language that's kind of the opposite of what you're asking. So one language that's super interesting to me is Yoruba, which is an African language. And there's been several people who have published saying that Yoruba doesn't do gender. Like, that's literally the title of a paper. And so basically their assertion is that historically the Yoruba language didn't even have semantic gender. Like, the only things that were there were the two words to describe the physical body. That was it. And then we see that their classification system in their society was really based on age and all of that. But yeah, so they directly say Europeans coming in are what brought us this semantic gender. But we can see that Yoruba hasn't changed and added like anything grammatical, pronoun, like it's still just the semantic words in there. But yeah, we definitely see that there's more languages that recognize a third or fourth or multiple genders that don't have that grammatical framework or haven't historically had that grammatical framework. But we also see cultures that have managed to survive Europeans. So the Bugis of India, I believe, are a great culture. They recognize 5 genders and historically have recognized those 5 genders, which can basically be equated to our terms as like male, female, transgender, male, transgender, female, and this in between, which was usually viewed as like a shaman, two-spirited, which sometimes equated to people like literally split down the middle, like masculine this way, feminine that way. Really interesting. And so even with European pressure and the stigmatism that was put on them, they've been able to survive through all of that. And so, I mean, obviously they had the semantics already there because they had the words for each of those 5 genders, but they were able to survive without that grammatical, even with the European pressure. So I do personally believe that the languages without the grammatical gender are going to bounce back sooner, or the languages that have noun classes that don't include gender.
Thank you, Lindsey. This was incredibly interesting. I couldn't help but think, you know, when you were presenting the whole presentation of my language. And I have two questions for you. One, what about some of the languages, for example, Arabic, is very gender-based. It's either masculine or feminine, kind of similar to how you were describing Spanish, and I don't know any Spanish. But it is a language that is derived from a religious book, from the Quran. What do you think would be, and we don't have, you know, like a third gender or a fourth or fifth, like some of the languages that you have spoken about. I'm just curious, I don't know if you can even answer this question, what would be, if there would be a movement towards creating pronoun, grammatical system, all that in a culture, in different cultures that are, we don't have the neuter, for example, in the actual language. How do you think the cultural movement, or how would it be implemented in cultures that speak that language, where you have the religion kind of in the background, you know, not as much support to it? And two, what is your next step after this in this research?
So to answer the first part of your question, it did. I just need to remember it. No, but to answer the first part, there are. So I've just started looking into this. I'm certainly not an expert on this aspect, but as I understand it, the French Language Council has actually been trying to implement this new part of the grammar, so implementing this like neutered or non-gendered or inclusionary gender. So they are working to change their gender or to change their grammar, because the society has understood a different type of gender, the non-binary. So it shows that it is possible. French, I think, is really a special case because they do have that language council, the people who look over the language and preserve it, per se, at least in general terms. That's their physical job. But other languages that, like, we have the prescriptive grammar, just like in English, we have this is the way you're supposed to say things. But if enough people say it, it gets added in. And that's what we're seeing with the English with the singular they. Yes, it's not grammatically gendered, but that's exactly what we're seeing. So if enough people say it, it becomes part of that language, because language and culture they're completely interconnected. So does that answer that question enough?
I think so. I mean, it's just, it made me think of something that never crossed my mind in my own language, you know? But yeah, my second part was, what are your plans after, you know, how are you going to follow up with this research?
So ideally, this is something that I would like to do forever, basically. I'd love to be able to expand it to more cultures, more languages, to be able to draw those dots. And like I said, it's hard to bring them both together, especially when you consider the ethnographic present and all of that. But just being able to do that more and more and looking at that, and maybe even going, like, diving deep into a specific language and looking into those psychoanalytics and all of that kind of stuff. But beyond that, I'd really love to expand this beyond gender and to look at other personal identity traits. So look at the ideas of maybe sexuality, of race, and all of that, and how that is constructed in gender, and maybe find similar things. Maybe, I mean, in English, we can see that we have racist language. Like there is a positive semantic space for middle-aged white guys, but there's negative semantic space in all other ways. Like we have bad words for Black people. We have bad words for Mexicans, we have bad words for women. And if you look at, like, say, taboo language in English, almost all of that is like either a fart joke or a joke about a woman. Like, son of a bee it's about a woman. Bastard, it's about a woman. It's about the mother. So we have that missing semantic space in there, and I'd really love to, like, look more into that, into the other other identities besides just gender. So yeah.